The unseen in the woods. I have spent 15 years working as a park ranger in one of the most remote forests in North America. I've seen the beauty of nature in its purest form, and I've also seen the brutal indifference of the wild. I thought I had seen everything, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered one fateful autumn night. The air was crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine needles thick in my nostrils. The park was mostly empty, save for a few late-season hikers. I was on my usual patrol, checking the more isolated trails before the coming storm made them impassable. The radio at my hip crackled, but no voice came through, just a burst of static that made the hair on my arms stand up. Something about that night felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves from unseen creatures, just an unnatural stillness, as if the entire world was holding its breath. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a man, a tall, thin figure standing at the edge of my flashlight's reach. It didn't move, just stood there between the trees, watching. "Sir?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "Park's closing soon? You lost?" No response. I took a few steps forward, my boots crunching softly on the frost-bitten leaves. My instincts screamed at me to stop, to turn back. But I was a ranger, I had a job to do. The figure stepped forward, and my breath caught in my throat. Its proportions were off. Too tall, limbs too long, a face that didn't look quite right, as if someone had tried to make a human, but had only a vague idea of what we were supposed to look like. The mouth was too wide, the eyes sunken and dark. It tilted its head slightly as if studying me, and then it grinned. A horrible stretched grin that revealed rows of needle-like teeth, too many for any human mouth. My hand instinctively dropped to my holster, but before I could even think to draw my weapon, the thing moved. No, it shifted. One moment it was standing there, the next it was closer. Too close. The air around it felt wrong, like the static from my radio had come alive and was pressing against my skull. My vision blurred, and for a split second, I swore I could hear something whispering, not in words, but in jagged, broken sounds that made my stomach twist. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run. Somehow, my feet obeyed. I turned and sprinted down the trail, lungs burning, heartbeat hammering in my ears. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. By the time I reached my truck, the night had returned to its unnatural silence. I locked the doors, started the engine, and peeled out of there like the devil himself was on my heels. I never reported what I saw. Who would believe me? But I know one thing for sure. Something is out there, deep in the woods, and it's watching. The Hollow One. I never used to be afraid of the forest. It was my home, my sanctuary. As a park ranger, I knew every tree, every trail, every hidden grove where the light barely touched the ground. But after that night, I will never step into the woods alone again. It started with a missing camper. We got the call around dusk. An experienced hiker named Mark hadn't returned to his campsite. His girlfriend was frantic, saying he'd gone to gather firewood but never came back. The sun was already dipping below the tree line, and the thought of someone lost out there in the dark made my skin prickle. I set out alone, knowing the terrain better than anyone. I followed the path he would have taken, calling his name. My voice felt small in the vastness of the silent trees. Then I found the first sign something was wrong. A bundle of sticks arranged in a perfect circle, not broken or scattered like someone had dropped them, but deliberately placed. In the center, a single footprint, deep, distorted, like something heavy had stood there for too long. I kept going, a knot tightening in my stomach. About 10 minutes later, I spotted his flashlight, half buried in the dirt. The battery was still working, but the beam was shaky, flickering like a dying candle. That's when I heard it. Not Mark, not an animal, a voice. It was whispering my name. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The voice was close but wrong, like someone was trying to mimic human speech without fully understanding it. It stretched and cracked, my name warping into something unrecognizable. I turned my own flashlight toward the sound, and I saw it. A figure standing between the trees. At first glance, it looked like a man, tall, unmoving, but its face was missing. Where its features should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin, like clay that had never been shaped. But I knew it was looking at me. I felt it, and then it took a step forward. Every part of me screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as the thing took another step. The air around it seemed to warp, like heat rising from asphalt. And then it spoke again. My voice. It repeated my last words in my voice, but twisted, stretched out like a record played too slow. I don't remember how I got back to the station. The next thing I knew, I was locking the doors behind me, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold my keys. I reported Mark as missing, but I never told anyone what I saw. They found his body 3 days later, miles from where he disappeared. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just his body lying in a clearing, his face missing, like something had erased him. I quit my job a week later, moved far from the forest, but sometimes at night I still hear my name being whispered. And I know it's waiting for me to come back. The thing in the fog. I used to love the quiet of early morning patrols. There was something peaceful about the forest before the world woke up. The mist rolling through the trees, the soft rustling of unseen creatures, the smell of damp earth. But one morning changed everything. Now the quiet fills me with dread. It started just before dawn. I was making my way along the old fire road, my breath clouding in the crisp air. The fog was thick that day, so dense that my flashlight barely cut through it. Everything beyond a few feet was swallowed in gray. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the quick darting steps of a deer or the skittering of a raccoon. These were slow, deliberate, human. Someone was walking just out of sight, hidden by the fog. "Hey," I called out. "Park's not open yet. You lost?" No answer. I took a step forward, straining to see through the mist. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment there was only silence. Then, just as I was about to turn back, the footsteps started again, this time behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. The fog was thicker now, pressing in like something alive. I couldn't see more than a foot in any direction. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I reached for my radio. "Base, this is Ranger Holt. I think I've got someone on the trails before opening hours. Can you confirm any campers in the area?" Static. Then a voice. Not from the radio, from the fog. It whispered my name. I felt a cold wave wash over me. It wasn't possible. No one knew I was out here, not this early. The voice came again, but this time it was wrong. Stretched, gurgling, like something was trying to speak but didn't understand how. I turned and ran. Branches lashed at my face as I sprinted blindly through the trees. The footsteps followed, fast now, impossibly fast. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, closing in, reaching. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the fog thinned. The trees parted. I stumbled onto the main road, gasping for breath. The footsteps stopped. When I looked back, the forest was still. The fog had lifted. There was nothing there. I never told anyone what happened that morning. Who would believe me? But sometimes when I'm walking the trails and the mist starts to rise, I swear I can still hear it. Those slow, deliberate footsteps. And a voice, whispering my name. The watcher in the tree line. I don't scare easily. 15 years as a park ranger will do that to you. I've dealt with everything from lost hikers to territorial bears. But what I saw last winter, what saw me, still keeps me awake at night. It was mid-January, the dead of winter. The park was closed for the season, but I had to check the back trails for storm damage. Heavy snow blanketed the ground, untouched except for my own footprints. It was one of those days where the sky was a dull gray, the air thick with silence, no birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots. Then I noticed something strange. Another set of footprints. They weren't human. They weren't anything I could recognize. Each print was elongated, almost skeletal, with long, thin marks behind them, like something had been dragging clawed fingers through the snow. They weren't there when I passed that way earlier. I should have turned back right then. But I didn't. I followed them. The tracks led me deeper into the trees, winding between the pines in a pattern that felt deliberate, like whatever made them wanted me to follow. The farther I went, the heavier the silence became, pressing against my ears like a thick fog. Then I saw it. At first, it looked like a person standing between the trees, tall, thin, completely still. But the longer I looked, the more wrong it became. Its limbs were too long. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if its neck had been stretched. Its skin was the same color as the bark, blending into the trees. It had no eyes, but I knew it was looking at me. The thing took a step forward, and I swear to God, the shadows around it moved. That was enough for me. I turned and ran, following my own footprints back toward the road. My lungs burned, my pulse pounded in my skull. I could feel it behind me, its presence like a cold breath on the back of my neck. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I slammed the door, locked it, and sat there, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. My breath fogged up the windshield, but through the haze, I saw movement at the tree line. It was still there, watching. I don't patrol those trails anymore, and I don't go into the woods alone, because I know it's waiting. And next time, I might not make it out. The thing that knocked back. There's an old ranger station deep in the woods, one we don't use anymore. It's been abandoned for years, left to rot as the forest slowly reclaims it. The roof sags, the windows are shattered, and the door barely hangs on its hinges. But we still get reports about it. Campers say they hear noises from inside at night. Some claim they see movement through the broken windows. I never believed the stories, until the night I had to stay there. A winter storm had rolled in faster than expected, covering the roads in thick ice. I was too far from the main station to make it back safely, and the abandoned outpost was my only option for shelter. The place was freezing, but at least it was dry. I got a fire going in the old stove, wrapped myself in my coat, and settled in for what I hoped would be an uneventful night. It wasn't. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound, a faint tap, tap, tap from somewhere in the station. I sat up, listening. The wind howled outside, branches creaked in the cold, but this sound was different, rhythmic, intentional. Someone or something was knocking. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the room. The front door was still shut. The windows were empty black voids, revealing nothing but the swirling snow outside. Then the knocking came again. This time it was closer. Tap, tap, tap. Right outside the wall behind me. My breath caught in my throat. No one should have been out there. Not in this weather. Not this deep in the forest. I stood slowly, my boots barely making a sound on the rotting floorboards. My fingers hovered over my sidearm. I took a deep breath, stepped toward the door, and knocked back. Tap, tap. For a long moment there was silence. Then, from directly outside, too close, impossibly close, came 3 more knocks. Tap. I didn't move. My pulse roared in my ears. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced along the walls. I reached for the door handle, hesitated, and then something knocked from inside the room with me. I spun, shining my flashlight wildly. The room was empty, but the knocking continued, moving along the walls, circling me as if something was testing the boundaries of the space. I couldn't take it. I grabbed my gear and bolted. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The next morning, when I returned with backup, the snow around the station was undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of life. But the door, which I knew I had closed behind me, was standing wide open, and on the inside of the rotten wood were 3 long scratches. The thing in the river. I always hated working near the river at night. Something about the way the water moved in the dark, too slow, too still, made my skin crawl. But as a park ranger, it was my job to patrol all areas, even the ones that gave me a bad feeling. One summer night, a fisherman went missing near the bend where the river curved into thick marshland. His boat was found, but he wasn't in it. No signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing. It was like he had simply stepped out of the boat and vanished. We searched for 3 days. Nothing, no tracks, no body. On the 4th night, I volunteered to check the riverbank one last time. The others had given up, but something inside me told me to go back. I don't know why. I wish I hadn't. The woods were deathly quiet as I made my way down to the shore. The moon was full, casting silver light over the slow-moving water. I called the fisherman's name, knowing it was pointless, but my voice barely made a ripple in the night. Then from the river, I heard a splash. I turned my flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut across the water, illuminating something floating just beyond the reeds. A man. He was standing waist deep in the river, perfectly still, his back turned to me. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his body. Something was off about the way he stood, too rigid, too unnatural. "Sir?" I called out, my throat dry. He didn't move. I stepped closer, boots sinking into the damp mud. "Sir, are you okay? Do you need help?" Slowly, so slowly, the man turned to face me, and I realized 2 things at once. First, His eyes were wrong. They were wide, unblinking, pure black like the deepest part of the river. Second, his mouth was open, but he wasn't breathing. Water dripped from his lips, bubbling up from inside him as if he were drowning even while standing there. His chest barely moved, and when it did, I heard a wet, gurgling sound, like something was trying to climb out of him. I took a step back. The man took a step forward. Water poured from his sleeves, his pant legs, his mouth. Too much water, more than should have been possible. It splashed onto the shore, dark and thick, carrying the stink of rot and something else, something ancient. Then, in a voice that wasn't his own, he whispered my name. I ran. I don't remember how I got back to my truck. I don't remember turning the key or driving back to the station. But I remember one thing. The next morning when the sun rose, we checked the river again. The fisherman's body had finally surfaced, mouth open, lungs full of water, and the skin of his fingers was worn down, as if he had been crawling at the riverbed, trying to pull himself out. The thing that followed me home. I've been a park ranger for nearly 2 decades, and in that time, I've encountered my fair share of strange things. Lights in the woods where no one should be, unexplained noises, tracks that don't match any known animal. But nothing ever scared me enough to quit, until something followed me home. It started with a call about a missing camper. A solo hiker, experienced, had failed to check in at the ranger station. His car was still in the lot, untouched for 3 days. I was assigned to sweep one of the deeper trails, an old, rarely used path winding through thick woods. The kind of place where the trees grow so close together that the sunlight barely reaches the ground. A few miles in, I found something strange, a pile of bones, small ones, picked clean, arranged in a perfect spiral on the forest floor. I'd seen predator kills before, but this wasn't natural. It looked deliberate. That's when I heard it, a sound coming from deep in the trees, a whisper, soft, almost human, but distorted like a voice played backward. It sent a shiver down my spine. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the woods with my flashlight. Nothing, just endless trees, shifting shadows. Then I saw movement, a shape just at the edge of my vision. Too tall, too thin. It ducked behind a tree the moment my light touched it. Every instinct told me to leave. Now, I radioed back to the station and keeping my voice steady. No sign of the hiker. I'm heading back. The static that answered me wasn't normal radio static. It was breathing, deep, slow. I turned off my radio and I ran. Branches clawed at my arms as I sprinted back to my truck. I didn't stop until I was inside, doors locked, hands shaking as I started the engine. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty trail. Empty. Except for a single, hand-shaped print on my windshield. Long fingers, too many joints. I drove out of there and didn't look back. But that night as I lay in bed, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, I heard it again. The whispering. Outside my window. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. And at night, I always keep the curtains closed. The thing that crawled out of the cave. I've always known that some places in the park weren't meant to be disturbed. There are old caves deep in the backcountry, places where even the animals refuse to go. We mark them on our maps, warn hikers to stay away, but some people just don't listen. Last fall, a group of cabbers went missing. 3 experienced guys, well-equipped, all confident they could handle themselves. They entered a cave we had listed as off-limits, one that had no official name, just a spot on the map marked with a red X. They never came out. A week later, I was part of the search team sent to find them. We followed their trail deep into the cave system, our headlamps casting shaky beams against the damp rock walls. The air was thick, stale, filled with the scent of something rotting. Then we found the first body, or what was left of it. His gear was torn apart, his bones picked clean. No signs of an animal attack, no blood, no struggle, just empty clothes and a twisted mess of ribs. It was as if something had peeled him open. The second body was farther in. He was alive when we found him. Barely. He was curled up against the cave wall, whispering something over and over. His fingers were raw, bloody, nails torn down to nothing. He must have been trying to claw his way out. We leaned in to hear what he was saying. "They let it out?" he whispered. We let it out. His eyes flicked past us, into the darkness, and that's when we heard the sound. A wet, slithering scrape echoing from the deeper tunnels, something huge shifting in the shadows. We grabbed the survivor and ran. I don't remember how we got out of there, only that I didn't stop running until I saw sunlight again. The other two cavers were never found. No one goes near that cave anymore. We sealed the entrance, filed the case as an unresolved accident. But sometimes on quiet nights, I swear I can hear something in the distance. A slow, scraping sound. Getting closer.